The Peloponnesian War would see Athens and Sparta involved in a drawn-out war between two behemoth powers that would influence and affect several other regions in the world, making a massive impact on the future of the region and on history as we know it. At stake was dominance within the region. It would eventually see the involvement of the large, expansive and powerful Persian Empire, which would be on the side of the Spartans. At the end of the conflicts in which Sparta would emerge victorious, we would see several aspects in the region change. One aspect was who was the dominant power at the end of the wars. In this case, Sparta emerged as the more dominant of the two powers after the wars, added to which was the economic boons that came with it. In this audio podcast we will explore the motivations, the events, the individuals, and the strategies of the wars, as well as the economic consequences and other aspects as we dive into the conflicts. The years before the war would be marked by a growing Athens which was growing in its influence, but the period would also be noted for the tensions growing between Athens and the Peloponnesian states. The Delian League would play an important role in the events that would occur during the wars. The League had achieved a major role in driving the Persians away from the Aegean, and in liberating many states from Persian control. Created during 478 BC, it was a coalition of states with Athens as a dominant party. However, with time, disputes would arise within the League, as exemplified by the rebellion of Thassus in 465 BC, and at other times, the League would be used for the individual interests of an Athens that increasingly was becoming more and more powerful in relation to its other Greek comrades. In addition, more funds were being utilized in ways that mostly benefited Athens and its interests. 480 BC would see the start of the Second Persian invasion of Greece, which ended in Persian defeat. A quick look at the Greco-Persian Wars. The Greco-Persian Wars would be fought between 499 and 449 BC between the Greek city-states and the Achaemenid Empire. It would end in Greek victory. It would also see the likes of Miltiades, Pericles, Leonidas I, Themistocles, Xerxes, Artemisia, and Darius the Great. It would end in the change of territory, with several states gaining their independence and being liberated. But what would start the conflicts, and what events would cause two of the world's behemoths to come to such a clash? In 547 BC, Cyrus the Great had overcome Ionia, a region for which Miletus would be the most important city. Cyrus the Great was the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and in his reign he would go on to achieve several feats, including winning against the Median Empire. The empire he created would also continue to have presence in West and Central Asia. In Ionia, tyrants would be placed in charge on behalf of the Persian Empire, and these would create discontent within the population. One of these tyrants would play a role in the start of the Ionian rebellion that would lead to the beginning of the Greco-Persian Wars. The story goes like this. Aristagoras was the tyrant of Miletus. And at one point in time, with the backing of the Persians, he would move to invade the island of Naxos. But the attempt would be fated to fail, in part, due to a conflict that occurred between Aristagoras and a Persian admiral. Knowing that the end of his reign was near, Aristagoras would move to incite revolution against the Persians. An act that history would come to know him for. The Ionian Revolt had been born. Athens and Eretria would help the Ionians in this. In 498 BC, Sardis, a Persian regional capital, would be placed to siege by a Greek force, and eventually set aflame, accidentally or on purpose, in an act known as the Burning of Sardis. An act that would come to incite the Persian king Darius the Great. Fighting would therefore continue. In 492 BC the first Persian invasion would begin. Going back to the city-states of Athens and Eretria, this move was also a chance to punish the Athenians and Eretrians for their support for the Ionian revolt. All of Greece would be sent ambassadors from Darius who demanded surrender from them. Most of the states succeeded except Athens and Sparta. A massive war was coming. Another force, this time under Datis and Artaphernes, would be sent in 490 BC. And they would continue on to Naxos, an island that went on to be captured and burned. Datis was a noble and admiral. When the revolt in Ionia had occurred, Datis had been a commander in the Persian army, and he would play a part in some of the conflicts. He and Artaphernes would therefore be charged with this part of the campaign. Artaphernes was the younger of the pair, a nephew to Darius the Great. Their plan would be to use the eastern coast of Greece as an important region for part of their conflict. The Cycladic Islands would be added to the Persian Empire during this period, and Eretria would be besieged and would fall. After this, the force would arrive in Marathon. The setting for an upset which would define history for much of the following period, and put a pause on their plans. The Battle of Marathon. A battle between the Persian forces and the Greek forces would occur, the Athenians aided by Plataea. The Battle of Marathon would see the Athenian forces claim a victory that, with the events that had preceded it, seemed unlikely, but one that would dramatically change the course of events going forward. The Spartans would be observing a religious festival, so that when a messenger was dispatched to them seeking aid for the Athenians, they would not be able to send their aid to them, but they would be able to receive support from Plataea, a city-state found in Boeotia. Perhaps a great testament to the role of tactics on the battlefield, and a testament to the military and tactical ability of those present, the battle would be set before it started. To their advantage was the geography of the terrain. Playing to their advantage and preventing the Persians from mounting their full strength in one continuous force against the Athenians. They would attack with a fervor and purpose that, outnumbered, would be noted as near madness by the Persians who were facing them. The Athenians would eventually win the flanks, and work into the center, overwhelming the Persian force as they went, devastating the greater force until the Persians would be forced into a retreat. Soldiers would drive the beaten and humiliated Persians back to their ships, but they would still continue to lose men as they went. The numbers that the Persians lost would outnumber those the Athenians had lost by some way. Thus would end the Battle of Marathon. But it wasn't the end of Persia's attempts. An attack on Athens would be in their plans, and they would make a play for the city. But the Athenians would be aware and cognizant of this threat and would be prepared for it. The city would find itself sufficiently defended, repelling a Persian attack, and forcing them into a journey back. The Battle of Marathon within the context of the wars would be a significant point, for what would happen after and the message that the outcome sent. The great Persian army that had established a reputation for its might could be overcome. Victory was possible, and victory was within reach. There were weaknesses that could be used. But Darius wasn't one to stay and lick his wounds for long, and plans were already in the making for another attempt at the invasions. His vow on revenge had to be seen through, but it wasn't to be in his lifetime. He would die before seeing his aspirations fulfilled, and the throne would be passed on to his son, Xerxes I. After the death of Darius, Xerxes would take over, attending to Egyptian revolts, and handling them, before he continued where his father had started with the invasion of Greece. Plans had to be put in action, lessons learned from the first attempt had to be applied, and preparations for the wars had to be made. The Persian army would be drawn from several nations and regions. On the Greek side, the intervening time would be marked by several changes, including the death of Miltiades, who had played a significant role in the Battle of Marathon. But the Greeks wouldn't become completely unaware of the threat that the Persian nation still posed. Themistocles would see to it that their naval abilities would be increased. Though not without political resistance from several different quarters, and not without using some of his political knowledge and experience. Moving back to the wars, some of the Greek states would come together and meet in Corinth. A few things would change going forward. A confederation would emerge, and they would be able to bring together resources, and make decisions collectively, a feat that was made remarkable by the state of affairs between some of the Greek states, which had had a history of conflict, rivalries and clashes between them. In 491, when Darius had dispatched emissaries, seeking tokens of submission to his authority from the Greek states, Athens and Sparta would be in the minority as they refused. Sparta would throw the emissaries down a well, Athens would put the individuals to trial. About 10 years later, Xerxes decided to use Hellespont. His army would be able to make progress. One event that would gain some repute even far into the future would be the events that would occur at Thermopylae. Thermopylae was a narrow pass, renowned in part for its sulfur springs. Having failed to defend and repel the Persian forces' advances at the Vale of Tempe as they originally planned, the Greeks would move to use the intrinsic geography of Thermopylae to their advantage. And that is exactly what they did. Particularly Themistocles. Here is how the renowned battle that would see the greats like Leonidas of Sparta, and Leontiades of Thebes, would occur, and how around 7,000 would be able to face a force that was nearly 20 times larger. Themistocles, the man who had been able to convince other Athenians to build a navy, would convince the Greeks to take part in an attempt to stop the Persian advance. This would stall the Persians' further advance on the land, whilst a second part would block the Persians at sea at the Straits of Artemisium. The 7,000 Greeks would be led by the Spartan king Leonidas I. The Spartans would unfortunately be observing the festival of Carneia, added to which were the Olympic Games and the Olympic truce. Spartan law made military actions during the festival of Carneia unacceptable, and unthinkable. But an advance force of 300 would be sent. The Spartans were a force renowned and known for their abilities on the battlefield. It was how it ended up being that Leonidas and his hoplites would find themselves on the way to Thermopylae with soldiers that were able to join them from different cities. Camp was made at the middle gate, and a force of 1,000 were sent to guard a track in the mountains that was a vulnerability to the plan of the Greeks. Through it, their flank could be overcome and approached. The odds that the Greeks were facing at this point were immense, the numerical supremacy of the Persians was vast and defeat seemed all but certain, but the story that follows represents a David versus Goliath level of victory against an enemy that had greater resources at its disposal. Persian forces would be sent against the Greek phalanx. The Greek phalanx would see men arranged next to each other, bravely and sternly, with overlapping shields with interspaced spears stretching out from the wall. Wave after wave was sent, wave after wave would fall from the Persians, but few from the Greeks' side would fall. The Immortals would also be sent, but they too would find the challenge of the well-organized, well-drilled, and well-planned phalanx too difficult to overcome. Day 2 of the conflict would come, and little would change in the trajectory that the battle was going. Enter Ephialtes, a local who would approach the Persians with knowledge of a path. The Persians, now armed with an opportunity to unravel the Greeks and their insurmountable defense, would take it, and by the third day, they would use the path. The Persians would be able to bypass the Phocians that had been placed by Leonidas to guard the path, and Leonidas, gaining knowledge of this development, would call for a council of war. Some argued for retreat, but Leonidas had decided to stay, and others would stay with him. On the battlefield, he would order some forces to retreat. He and the Spartans that had come with him, along with others including some Thespians, Thebans and Helots, would guard the retreat of a greater force at great personal cost and peril to them, but with the fate of everyone they loved on the line. An ultimate demonstration of sacrifice, bravery and dedication. In the conflicts, Xerxes would lose 2 of his brothers, Abracamas and Hyperanthes. Whilst the pass was being held at Thermopylae by King Leonidas and the men that were with him, a second conflict, just as central and essential to the Greco-Persian wars, was occurring. This one at sea. It would occur near Evia. A storm would reduce the numbers of the ships the Persians had been able to amass, doing massive damage to the force that had been prepared for the invasion. The first loss to the Persian forces would happen off the coast of Magnesia. But the calamities at sea would not stop. A second group would be caught as they sailed around the coast of Evia. When the Allies found out about the fate of the ground forces at Thermopylae, they withdrew to Salamis. This occurred after days of conflict that would see losses on both sides. With the Allies retreating, Phocis, Boeotia and Attica would fall to the Persians, who would be able to enter into the walls of Athens. For their retreat, the Allies had chosen the island of Salamis. Some Athenians would have been evacuated from Athens to Salamis. The few that remained would offer resistance to the Persians, but would ultimately lose. At a point, in the course of events, Xerxes would call a war meeting. During it, certain individuals would warn him about the risks and disadvantages of attacking the Allies' position. Advice that he would ignore, to his undoing. Added to the information that was privy to Xerxes would be information that Themistocles would purposely add, or allow to filter due to a level of cunning and foresight. Some of it might have included stories of growing disunity between the Allies, issues concerning their next moves, and the location of their forces. Subterfuge and foresight would be Themistocles' weapon of choice, and the information that he was able to feed Xerxes would ultimately work its way into achieving his goals. Xerxes would dispatch his fleet. After the battle, a council of war would be held. Xerxes, perceiving the possibility that his army might find itself marooned in Europe if the Greeks had chosen to target Hellespont. The bulk of the army was withdrawn, leaving Mardonius with some of the troops to complete the effort at invasion. When they withdrew from Athens, the Athenians would be able to retake it, but at some point in the future they would lose Athens, once again to the Persians. But the Battle of Salamis had already gone some way into creating doubt in the Persians, and weakening their position. The battle would be remembered as an important point in the course of the wars, and an important part of history. After the battle, a stalemate would result, with neither side wanting to attack the other for a while. Mardonius would send an offer to the Athenians, which was rejected, the Athenians preferring freedom. With the offer refused, the Persians made their move, reoccupying Athens, and again sending an offer. The Athenians would look for assistance from Sparta, and Sparta would deploy a force. The episode that follows would further cement the fate of the Persians, and further strengthen the position that the Allies would now have. The Battle of Mycale and the Battle of Plataea 479 BC. The Greek army would make an aggressive move to march out, causing the Persian army's retreat. Fortified camp would be made by the Persians on the bank of the Asopus River. But the Greeks would decide against further progress. The position they held was higher and to their advantage. The Persians would attempt several times to change this, and get the Greeks to cede this advantage. The Greeks would attempt to retreat to another location when their supply was interrupted, and their access to water was hampered. The Allies' retreat would be filled with chaos and mistakes. The Persians would follow them as they retreated. But some forces from the Allies would stand ground, and the battle would prove successful for the Greek allies. Mardonius would pass away in the battle. A few Persians would flee, then more and more joined until it was a general retreat. Storming the Persian camp would be a step taken by the Greeks. Being able to break through eventually, the Persians would have a lot of casualties. Few would be left to live. The victory here at Plataea would be massive. The Battle of Mycale would see the Allies emerge triumphant as well. With the Persian ships in poor state, the Persians initially chose to remain out of the fray, choosing to put their ships to land, and protect them. But the Allies would attack, and win. Thus the Persian ships would be set to the flame. An important step towards further weakening the position of the Persians. The Persians would retreat, losing many men along the way. Some would fall to the enemies, some to sheer exhaustion. And furthermore to privation and hunger. A new era was born which would see a new tide set in, and the fate of the Greek world take a new direction. Back to the Peloponnesian War. 465 BC. The Helots, were people who were mostly involved with agricultural activity, whilst the Spartans occupied themselves with warfare and the preparation for it. They made a significant part of the population but was however mistreated, which created the conditions that were rife for a revolt. In addition to this, their numbers in relation to those of the Spartans varied at different points in history. When they revolted, Sparta would receive help from its allies who would send forces to help overcome the revolt. Athens, like Sparta's other allies, would send aid but would be rejected. The Spartans had a mistrust of Athens, a sign of a deteriorating relationship between the Spartans and the Athenians. Another sign would be when the Helots were overcome and left the state, they would be settled in Naupactos with Athenian aid. 459 BC. Megara and Corinth are engaged in a conflict. Megara was a city-state that had also involved itself in the fight against the Persians, fighting side by side with the Spartans and Athenians. It would be located within Attica. Megara and Corinth were both Sparta's allies. In the war, Athens sided on the side of Megara, and an alliance was made. The Megarans switched over from the Peloponnesian League and joined Athens in the Delian League. This conflict between the two states would come to be considered significant enough to be a contributor to the start of Peloponnesian War. 460 BC. Start of the First Peloponnesian War. Several causes could be attributed to the war, from growing Athenian influence, Megara's actions in changing its allegiance, and several other factors. Numerous battles would occur over the course of the wars, some of them involving fierce fighting. At stake in these conflicts was dominance in the region, and the events during the wars would be remembered in history. The year 460 BC would also see the Battle of Oenoe. 457 BC would see a battle that ended in Spartan victory, the Battle of Tanagra. It saw the involvement of Myronides on the Athenian side and Nicomedes on the Spartan side. Myronides would be involved in the conflict between Corinth and Megara, and also in the Battle of Oenophyta. Nicomedes, on the other hand, would occupy the role of regent for King Pleistouanax, who was his nephew. Nicomedes was also the son of Cleombrotus, a man who had acted as regent for the son of the great Leonidas, Pleistarchus. Battle of Oenophyta, it took place in 457 BC, with the battle at Tanagara preceding it. In the Battle of Tanagra, both sides had lost significant troops, but Sparta had emerged claiming victory. Another conflict would come in the form of the Battle of Oenophyta. Oenophyta would be a town located in Boeotia. In the aftermath of the battle, Athens would be able to finish building up the long wall, and Boeotia would come to be under them. They would also move on to other areas. Egyptian campaign. The Athenians would make moves to support a rebellion in Egypt which had been a satrapy of the Persian Empire. Inaros would be the individual who would play a large role in the rebellion. He would reach out to the Delian League for support, which would see the Athenian admiral Charitimides, who had been campaigning elsewhere, be redirected towards the conflict. The Athenians would initially win against the Persians, but a reversal in their fortunes would come in time. Athens would be defeated in 454 BC by a man who was a satrap in Syria. He went by the name of Megabyzus. Athens would find itself involved in the wars for several reasons, including interests in trade, and the ability to strike a blow at Persia. Artaxerxes I would be the Persian king at the time, and he would send a force to overcome the revolt. Numerous battles would occur over the period, including the siege of Memphis, the siege of Prosopitis, and the Battle of Mendesium. The year 454 BC would see the Persians achieve a victory over the Athenians. The year would also see the 5 years' truce. 448 BC saw the Second Sacred War, which would end with the Spartans triumphant against the Phocians. The victory would afford the Delphians the ability to govern themselves once again. 446 BC. Boeotian Revolt. The 30 Years' Peace would be signed around 446 or 445 BC, and in 440 BC, one of Otane's ally, Samos, would rebel. The Samian War would ensue and end in success for Athens, and Samos' yielding of defeat. The event would see the involvement of Pericles. Several terms would be given to the Samians. During this period, the prospect of war against Athens would be discussed amongst Sparta and its allies, but eventually decided against for several reasons, including the predisposition towards war of some of Sparta's allies and issues surrounding preparedness towards the war. 433 BC. Trade sanctions by Athens would be placed against Megara. Megara was a Spartan ally. 434 BC would see a conflict between Corinth and Corcyra, and a battle known as the Battle of Sybota. The chapter would involve a clash between several states, that would involve members of the Delian League and members of the Peloponnesian League. Involved in it as well would be the states of Epidamnus, Corcyra, Corinth, Athens, and eventually Sparta, in a conflict that would be noted in history as an important and critical event. One full of political considerations. It would change the course of history and change the fate of the world. The epic and important story goes like this. The founding of the city of Epidamnus had involved colonists from Corcyra. This played a role in defining the interpretation of events when the Democrats on Epidamnus approached Corinth seeking aid. Corcyra was a colony of Corinth, and the relationship between it and Corinth was strained. Previous events had stirred a growing resentment and tension within the relationship. When internal conflicts between the oligarchs and the Democrats on Corcyra erupted, and involved matters like a coup that had replaced the oligarchs with the Democrats, other city-states would become involved in the events. A conflict on an island would draw in regional powers. Corinth was one of those states. The Epidamnian Democrats would come to receive promises of assistance from Corinth when they went to seek it, Corinth finding expedient attributes to provide that aid given their relationship to Corcyra, and the previous turns that had occurred within their relationship and the greater context of events. An act which played a role in pushing Corcyra to become involved, which it subsequently did, making demands of its own that would involve the expulsion of the Corinthians from the state. Add into this the greater context of affairs in the region, especially regarding Athens, the Peloponnesian League, the Delian League, and Sparta. The actions on Epidamnus would continue to draw in more and more parties to be intermediaries, participants, detractors, advocates and allies in the affairs, and would lead to growing tension. Other members of the Peloponnesian League would come to play a role. Several exchanges between Corcyra and Corinth would result, and at some point in time, Corcyra would threaten with the possibility of seeking Otane's aid and therefore involving the powerful city-state which had more resources behind it. Again, several interactions would occur between Corinth and Corcyra, seeking a resolution to affairs that was peaceful, with the involvement of Sparta. But war would eventually find itself declared on the side of the Corinthians. The conflict would involve the Corcyrians and the Corinthians. Corinth would develop itself into more of a naval authority. Athens would find itself called into agreeing to aid the Corcyrians if they were attacked, which was different from absolute support. Several considerations would be made in the Athenians' decision to offer this aid, including opinions about the balance in naval strength within the region. Enter the Battle of Sybota. It occurred around 433 BC, and would see Corinth and Corcyra, as well as some allies involved, and also saw numerous individuals also involved, the likes of Lacedaemonius, and also several ships. An Athenian fleet had been sent with instructions guiding their behavior in the events involved. The arrival of Corinthian ships would cause the Corcyrian ships to prepare, maneuvering into a formation in preparation. Eventually conflict between the two fleets would occur, the end of which saw the Athenians and the Corcyrians turning about in the direction of Corcyria, in order to protect it from attack. The conflict would result in intense fighting between the two fleets, one that initially saw the Athenians mostly uninvolved. But as events unfolded, The war progressing poorly for the Corcyraeans, the Athenians would eventually find themselves involved in the fighting. The Corinthians would emerge victorious in the conflicts. In the meantime, more ships from Athens would arrive, and amidst the growing contingent of ships on the Corcyraean side, further conflict would be circumvented and the Corinthians would retreat. A decision that would have some bearing on future events. The Battle of Potidaea in 432 BC would occur soon after, and would see several parties involved, including Archestratus, Callias, and Aristeus, who was a Corinthian general. A siege would also occur that would end up heavily costing Athens financially. During the events occurring at Potidaea, war would be declared in formal terms in a meeting attended by individuals from Corinth, Athens, and Sparta. With growing tensions, this episode would be filled with intense fighting and conflict amidst several demands that had been made by Athens on a member of the Delian League in the form of Potidaea. Events would follow that would lead to a battle. We will explore these events in more detail, looking at what had led to the situation, the individuals involved including Archestratus, and the roles they would play. We will also look at the strategies that were used, and the overall outcomes and consequences of the conflicts. We start with Potidaea itself, which would find itself in an interesting situation linked to how it had started, a colony of Corinth on one side, yet it was a member of the Delian League on the other. It would therefore be the site of tensions that were beyond itself. At a similar time, activities beyond its walls would see revolts in several areas incited and encouraged by the influence of Perdiccas II of Macedon. Athens would make several demands of Potidaea, some of them in relation to Corinth, and the judges that were received by Potidaea. Athens had its reasons for these demands. Nonetheless, Potidaea would see several revolts and Athens would send a fleet. These events would see the involvement of Archestratus. The fleet that was sent originally had a different objective, but they were ordered to Potidaea. The Macedonians that were there would be attacked by the fleet. Other states would also be involved, including Corinth, which had sent some hoplites and troops. Sparta would promise to help the Potidaeans. The Athenians would then travel to Potidaea, and a battle would ensue between the large and combined forces present. Fighting with mixed outcomes would occur. Some Corinthian troops would be able to gain victory against some Athenians, but in other areas the Athenians would be able to defeat Corinthian troops. Other conflicts would occur, including some with some of the reserve troops of the Potidaeans. Eventually a blockade would be effected by Athens. The siege would also have consequences politically for some of the states involved, including Athens. 432 BC. Some Peloponnesian League members are called to Sparta. A debate occurs. Representatives from Athens are also in attendance of the debate, as well as representatives from Corinth. Several arguments would be made here for several courses of action. Sparta voted to declare that the actions of the Athenians had surmounted to compromising peace. Archidamus II, a Spartan king, would argue against the war. Eventually war would be declared. Several factors had contributed to the eventual escalation to war, including events in Potidaea, and the Megarian decrees. 431 BC. Archidamian War. The Spartans and the Athenians would pursue their own war strategies over the course of the conflicts based on what they perceived to be the weakness of their counterparts, and their own strengths. Sparta would invade land around Athens, whilst Athens on the other hand would use more of their fleet and its strengths against the Spartans. Though the Spartan strategy would still leave the sea still open to Athens. In 430 BC an event would occur that would drastically change the fate of the war, and would contribute to weakening the Athenians. Some of them who had been forced to enter the confines of the long walls due to the Spartan invasion of surrounding land, would be struck by a plague which would greatly reduce the population of the city. Several important individuals would die with the plague, including soldiers, and even Pericles himself. The plague would have an impact on the course and eventual outcomes of the wars. Along with Pericles' death, change was on the verge for the Athenian strategy. Elements would emerge and contribute to a change in strategy, and this would include a man known as Cleon. A man called Demosthenes also would be involved in events during this period. The general period would also be characterized by several events in the Athenian world, including an increase in military activity within several regions, and naval raids that would lead to several victories. These raids would occur within the Peloponnesian region. A post near Pylos would be relevant in this period. The post attracted several helots, the subjugated population in Sparta that Sparta had feared could revolt. Sparta responded to this growing threat by attacking Pylos. Several battles would follow which would be significant for various reasons. In 425 BC the Battle of Pylos would occur. It would end in Athenian victory. On the post would be soldiers, hoplites, and archers, and these would be used to great effect by Demosthenes to defend the post against the army that had come outnumbering it. They would prevent the Spartans from successfully storming Pylos. The Spartans would move to prepare to lay siege, but as they did, a ship arrived with Athenian forces, who overpowered the Spartans, leading to a renowned defeat, and cutting the Spartans from effectively escaping as they remained on an island called Sphacteria. With events unfolding as they did, the Spartan government would be forced into responding. They sent individuals to represent the government of Sparta. Negotiations for lasting peace would occur and would fail. The Athenians would eventually attack the Spartans that were on the island, which led to the Battle of Sphacteria. In the Battle of Sphacteria the Spartans in turn would face the force which was led by Cleon and Demosthenes, after the Athenians had initially tried starving the Spartans, by denying them access to food supplies. Fighting would occur that would result in several casualties. At the end of fighting, however, the Spartans would be overcome. The Battle of Sphacteria would be significant in the course of the wars and in the course of Spartan history as well. With the men being held hostage by the Athenians would make demands of the Spartan government, which also included issues surrounding Attica. Capturing of Amphipolis. Amphipolis is captured by Brasidas, who was a Spartan general. Prior to the event, Brasidas had captured and taken Acanthus, and had played a role in preventing Megara from falling into the hands of the Athenians. Amphipolis had significant economic importance for the surrounding silver mines, and was an Athenian colony. The Athenians in the colony would send for aid, and it would be sent in the form of Thucydides. Thucydides would be exiled. The events that occurred at Amphipolis and his own failure to arrive on time would contribute to this outcome. Amphipolis would surrender before Thucydides could arrive. Several other towns would also be attacked by Brasidas. After the capture of Amphipolis, the Spartans and the Athenians would agree to an armistice which would specify that each party was to remain in the territory that they had gained, both sides having their own hopes of what they would be able to gain from the armistice. The armistice had ended in 422 BC. A battle would occur between Cleon and Brasidas and their troops as Athenian troops attempted to recapture Amphipolis in the Second Battle of Amphipolis. Cleon had been accompanied by hoplites and some cavalry but would have to retreat as he waited for more troops to join his. A retreat that would go poorly for the Athenians, and one that Brasidas would take advantage of to emerge triumphant against the Athenians, though during it Cleon would be killed and Brasidas would be injured severely, dying after victory had been achieved. The deaths would change the situation, and approaches of both the Spartan and the Athenians. The following year would see the signing of the Peace of Nicias. It brought to end fighting. The process would see the involvement of several important individuals, including Pleistoanax, who was a king of Sparta, and Nicias, who was an Athenian general. Through the peace treaty both sides were to regain some territory and other concessions from the other side, but the treaty would eventually be broken. 418 BC. Battle of Mantinea. An important and large battle in Greece which ended in triumph for the Spartans and changed the course of events for Sparta. It also saw Agis II, Pharax, Hipponoides, and Laches involved in the fighting. It was important for the message that it sent. 416 BC. Melos is invaded by Athens, and held to siege until they are forced to surrender amidst Athenian demands that they join the Delian League and pay the Athenians tribute. Melos, as an island, had been neutral in the wars between Athens and Sparta. 415 BC. Sicilian expedition starts. It would end in 413 BC. The Sicilian expedition would end in a decline in the troops and forces available to the Athenians. One individual in particular would claim one of the roles in prominence in the Sicilian expedition. A man called Alcibiades, who had been active within the political world of Athens, a student of Aristotle as well. Alcibiades would be one of the proponents of a more aggressive Athenian approach to the war. 415 to 413 BC would be the period during which the expedition would occur. But the leadership would change at some point, as Alcibiades would be forced back to Athens as he had to stand trial. Early on in the expedition, Syracuse would be enveloped. Gylippus, who was a Spartan general, with his troops would come. Several conflicts would occur, but Athenian defeat would be the outcome of the exchanges. 413 BC. The Second War starts. 412 BC. Persians are active in Ionia. Tissaphernes is involved in supporting the building of a Peloponnesian fleet. Tissaphernes was a Persian satrap. 411 BC. Athenian fleet on island of Samos fights the Spartans in the Battle of Syme. The period from 410 to 406 would see Athens win several conflicts, gaining land as a result. A man named Alcibiades would be relevant to this period in the wars. 408 BC. Darius II is increasingly involved in the wars. Cyrus the Younger, his son, is dispatched. He works together with Lysander, a Spartan general. 406 BC. Naval Battle of Notium. The naval battle of Arginusi results in a victory for the Athenians. Fallout from issues that arose from the battle would weaken Athens. 405 BC. Battle of Aegispotami sees victory for Sparta. The battle would occur in Hellespont, and would see several key individuals involved, including Lysander and Arachus, in a conflict that would have a massive impact for the individuals inside the region and for the history itself. At stake was the future of Athens and access to the resources that were needed for Athens to remain fed. Lysander would be heavily involved in events leading up to and the events during the battle. He was a Spartan, born around 454 BC. In 408 BC he would be made into admiral. His interaction with Cyrus would lead to Cyrus financially playing a large and critical role in the wars, which would massively benefit the Spartans, allowing them to undertake activities that would contribute to their eventual victory. His term as admiral would be followed by that of Callicratidas. The end. Lysander would eventually return as vice-admiral, and would receive a massive boost in the form of access to massive resources from Cyrus, which he would put to use with great effect. The end result of the Battle of Aegispotami was a massive loss of naval power for the Athenians, which would hasten their eventual demise and eventually contribute to the outcomes of the Peloponnesian Wars. Several cities would be captured by Lysander's fleet. Surrender from the Athenians would eventually come, as the position they were forced to occupy was a hard one to be in. The 30 Tyrants regime would soon follow. 404 BC. End of the wars. Peloponnesian League emerges victorious, surrender by Athens and allies. Sparta would now be the dominant party in the region. 395 to 387 BC would Corinthian War, which again shifts the balance between Athens and Sparta. Thank you for listening to this podcast episode on the important Peloponnesian War, as we looked into the events of the war, the strategies that were used, and the people involved. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more.